Hi, welcome to Trait Talking. I'm Dr. Stuart Grice, former academic at Oxford and co-founder of FitnessGenes. Alex isn't with us today. He's off at various fitness conferences. So today I'm going to be alone to tell you about a genetic variant that can reduce your susceptibility to viral infection, but may increase your risk of having poor gut microbiota. So let's go to the virus first. So this time of year, you may be aware that there's lots of vomiting and sickness bugs around. And one of the key viruses that is driving this is Norovirus. So Norovirus is incredibly common. It is incredibly infectious. Around 600 million people, up to 1 billion people can be infected by this a year. And it's the leading cause of gastroenteritis. So acute non-bacterial gastroenteritis is the disease or the condition it causes. And yeah, this causes vomiting and diarrhea. It can last about a week. It is foodborne, generally through the fecal oral route. So people not washing their hands, we know who you are spreading this. Make sure you're wiping the gym equipment down. So let's think about how you can be more or less susceptible to this virus. So viruses and bacteria need to enter your cells. Viruses always have to, bacteria sometimes they do, to cause infection. Viruses in particular because they need to hijack the cell's machinery to replicate and produce more virus particles. So if we think about this, is there a way or is there a process where we could reduce the ability for these viruses to enter the cell? Now, all our cells have molecules on the outside. These are associated with attachments, cellular signaling, communication. And a good example of these is the ABO blood group. So these are the carbohydrates, so sugar antigens as they're called, little tags on the outside of the cells that enable the blood cells to be recognized by the body. And we know this impacts transfusion, where certain blood groups cannot be used to transfuse individuals because the body recognizes or doesn't recognize the blood cells as self and then can destroy them. So actually these antigens, so these ABO antigens, also known as H, are actually not just found on blood cells. They're found on many other cells in the body. This includes the gut, the salivary glands, and a lot of secretory tissues, urinary tract, and some respiratory cavities. And these proteins on the outside of the cells can also be secreted into the lumen, so for example into the lumen of the gut. And of course, we've described that there's variation in these with the ABO groups. There are a number of genes and therefore the enzymes that these genes produce that create the diversity in these different antigen types. The one gene we're going to talk about today is FUT2, so fucosyl transferase 2, and this is one of the genes that's associated with building the core components of these tags that sit on the outside of the cells that then the A and B antigens are always attached to. But we're not talking about blood cells today, we're talking about how they behave in the gut. So if you have a normal fucosyl transferase enzyme, you'll be producing these H antigens. So we have these little tags on the outside of the cells, and you'll also be secreting these into the spaces, into the gut. There are people that have mutations in FUT2 that stop this enzyme being produced in large amounts. And actually it's about 15 to 20% of the people. So this is what is called homozygous recessive. So if you have two forms of the mutation, because we have two copies of each gene, that stops the protein, the enzyme being produced, you'll have very little production overall of the enzyme, and therefore you'll have a massive reduction in these molecules on the outside of cells, and importantly, the amount that's secreted into the lumen. So the people with this mutation are called non-secretors because they're not presenting these antigens or secreting them into the lumen of the gut. The people that do produce it are called secretors because they have lots of these signaling molecules, these antigens that sit on the outside of the cells, and secretion into the spaces, into the gut. So going back to infection now, why is this important? So if you think about what we talked about with viruses and bacteria attach to cells. Now, norovirus actually attaches via these ABO blood group molecules, these ABO blood group antigens. And this attachment facilitates the uptake of the virus into gut cells, which then enables the viruses to divide, which then drives the infection. So the viruses are in the cells because they've attached through this antigen. So the norovirus requires this antigen moiety. Now, we've talked about the fact that 15 to 20% of the population don't have these molecules on the cells. So what happens? The viruses do not connect to the cells. They're not drawn to the cells within the gut because there's no secretion of the factors into the gut, and they're not therefore infecting the cells. So if you are touching a piece of gym equipment or eating some food with norovirus on it, it will pass through your body, and it's a lot less likely to enter your cells and cause an infection. So these non-secretors are in essence immune. Now, this is not necessarily the case. So actually, interestingly, a lot of the early studies, so how this was actually found out was, I think it was in 1977, there's a study where people would purposely infect themselves with norovirus. Now, this is actually quite common in science. The famous Barry Marshall highlighted how Helicobacter pylori was associated with peptic ulcers by literally necking a culture of the bacteria. He won a Nobel Prize for that. Probably weighing it up was worthwhile for him. But these people were self-infected, and they showed within the population there were a group of individuals that were not getting the infection. Now, as we know, these ended up being the non-secretors, and multiple studies have been done since, and really we're seeing actually it's a 4 to 9-fold reduction in the amount of infection. So if you're a non-secretor, you still may get mild symptoms. On a rare occasion, you still may get an infection, but it's an incredibly significant reduction in that infection because you're reducing the ability for those bacteria to enter your cells. Now, this has more broad implications. So there are other cells that enter the gut, so rotaviruses, which are also associated with diarrhea and vomiting. One study showed that there's a 26% reduction in rotavirus infection for non-secretors. So just to summarize this bit, non-secretors are a lot less likely to get norovirus, an incredibly common foodborne pathogen, and also rotavirus, both of which that cause gastroenteritis, which is linked to vomiting and diarrhea, and these conditions can last over a week, but actually can be a lot more severe in young people and obviously in older people. So is that all bad for secretors? Well, actually no, because what we've just talked about is we have these little markers, these little attachment sites over our cells, and these will obviously be used by other species, so other genus of bacteria and genus of viruses. And now this is new research, but we're starting to see that actually the non-secretors have a reduced microflora diversity. And particularly we're looking at Bifidobacterium here, which is linked to a healthy gut. So when you're looking at non-secretors, they have lower diversity and lower levels of these what technically called healthy bacteria, which is an interesting thing to call them, but they have positive benefits to the person. The secretors have better diversity. Now, what does this mean? It seems quite descriptive, but actually we're starting to see that actually the non-secretors may be more susceptible to a broad range of inflammatory bowel conditions. And again, we're cropping up with this theme that comes up in a lot of our podcasts, which is around the idea of trade-offs. We have increased immunity, but potentially increased risk of conditions, inflammatory conditions, and sometimes you'll see this with autoimmune conditions as well. So ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, the risk for non-secretors seems to go up. Now, these are genetically very different diseases and in terms of the environmental impacts on them, but actually maybe the inability for the gut to manifest this broad healthy population of these bifidobacteria and other subgenre too, to actually support a healthy gut long term. So let's look at this in summary. So we have a genetic mutation in FUT2 that buckets people into secretors, so people that have these little tags on the cells, and non-secretors, people that don't. The non-secretors have a better resistance to norovirus and rotavirus because the viruses cannot enter the cells. However, because also it seems to reduce the ability for the microflora of the bacteria to colonize and attach and build diversity, it may also have a negative impact if you're a non-secretor, specifically through microbiota diversity and an increased risk of inflammatory bowel conditions. So I guess, what does this mean? So I guess for you secretors there, you have a reduced risk of inflammatory bowel conditions. It doesn't mean you are not going to get Crohn's disease. This is something that modifies and will enhance or reduce the risks. But you have an increase, but the secretors will have an increased risk of getting these infections. So really be very vigilant, particularly at these times of year of not washing your hands or being common spaces. So gyms are a prime example. Wipe that equipment down. You may seem overzealous in the gym, but actually susceptibility will mean there's a good chance you're going to get these conditions. And to be honest, they're pretty rubbish when you get them. Now, the flip side of the non-secretors, of course, it doesn't mean you won't get these viruses, but it does mean if you do get an infection, it might be a lot more mild, and also you may not get it at all. But you have this secondary issue with a slightly higher risk of inflammatory bowel conditions. So really think about looking after your gut health. The sensitivity to norovirus infection and increased risk of inflammatory bowel disease is pivoted on the gene we look at FitnessGenes. So this is FUT2. It's one of our 179 genetic traits now we look at in our products. If you want to find out whether you're a secretor or non-secretor, come check out our DNA analysis at fitnessgenes.com. Thank you very much for listening.